The day Harlan Dupree handed over that key, he was smiling the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. The kind that says, I know something you don't, and what I know is that you just made the biggest mistake of your life. The key belonged to a body shop on the east side of Greensboro, North Carolina. 1,200 square feet of crumbling cinder block, a roof that leaked in 3 places, and a hydraulic lift so rusted it hadn't moved in years. The previous tenant had walked away from it, owing 4 months of back rent, and left behind 2 stripped-down Civics, a wall of pegboard with nothing hanging on it, and enough rat droppings to fill a wheelbarrow. The asking price was $800 for the first month, first and last up front. 22-year-old Devonte Caldwell paid it in cash, every dollar he had. Harlan Dupree was the regional property manager for Eastfield Commercial Holdings, a company that owned 11 buildings in Guilford County, most of them in neighborhoods where people didn't have a lot of options. He'd watched Devonte walk into his office 3 times over 2 weeks. First visit, Harlan had barely looked up from his desk. Second visit, he'd told Devonte the space wasn't ready. Third visit, Devonte came with an envelope. Harlan took the envelope, counted it, set it on his desk like it had disappointed him. You know what that place needs? Harlan said, leaning back in his chair. About $40,000 and a miracle. He laughed a little when he said it. His assistant, a woman named Tricia Bowles, was standing near the filing cabinet, and she laughed too, the polite kind. Devonte didn't say anything. He picked up the key from the desk where Harlan had set it, put it in his pocket, and walked out. What Harlan didn't know, what nobody in that office knew, was that Devonte had been fixing cars since he was 14 years old. He grew up in a 2-bedroom house on Maplecroft Road with his grandmother, Cora Caldwell, who had worked 23 years at the textile mill before her knees gave out. His mother had left when he was 6. His father he knew by name only. Cora had raised him on a fixed income and sheer stubbornness, and she had 2 rules. Go to school and don't be idle. She didn't care what you did with your hands as long as you were doing something. What Devonte did with his hands was cars. It started because their neighbor, a man named Vincent Pryor, had a 1987 Chevy Caprice that spent more time on jack stands than on the road. Vincent was 50-something, retired, and happy to let a teenager poke around under the hood as long as the kid cleaned up after himself. Devonte learned by watching, then by doing, then by getting things wrong and figuring out why. By 16, he was charging kids at his high school $50 to do brake jobs in the school parking lot on Saturdays. By 18, he was doing full engine swaps out of his grandmother's driveway, running an extension cord from the house to a work light he'd bought at a yard sale. Cora never complained. She'd bring him a plate and set it on the hood and tell him to eat before it got cold. He never finished community college. Not because he wasn't smart enough. His math scores had surprised more than one counselor, but because sitting in a classroom talking about theory while there was actual work to be done felt like wearing shoes that didn't fit. He lasted 1 semester, withdrew, and went back to the driveway. For 4 years after that, he worked for other people. A dealership on High Point Road where the service manager, a thick-necked man named Dale Coburn, paid him $12 an hour and gave all the diagnostic work to the 2 white guys who'd been there longer. Devonte did oil changes, tire rotations, the stuff nobody else wanted. He didn't complain. He watched. He learned the dealership systems, its suppliers, its markup. He saved every dollar he didn't spend. Then Coburn passed him over for a lead technician position, a role Devonte had been doing the work of for 6 months without the title or the pay, and gave it to a guy named Pete Schiller who'd been there 8 weeks. Devonte handed in his notice the next morning. He'd been looking at the Eastfield property for 3 months before he walked into Harlan Dupree's office. He'd driven past it a dozen times, measured the bay doors from the street with his eyes, looked up the property records at the county assessor's office, talked to a plumber he knew about what it would cost to get the utility lines checked. The place was a mess. But the bones were there. The location was there. 2 blocks from a bus line, half a mile from a neighborhood where a lot of people owned older cars they couldn't afford to take to the dealership. And the rent, for all Harlan's contempt, was actually manageable if he could get customers in the door fast. Devonte had a plan. He just needed the key. The first week, he didn't work on a single car. He borrowed a pressure washer from Vincent Pryor and cleaned the floor. He patched the roof leak over the lift with roofing cement and a ladder he found behind the building. He fixed the hydraulic lift himself. A collapsed fitting and a blown seal, 2 hours of work, $40 in parts. He hung a corkboard inside the front window and put up a handwritten sign, Caldwell Auto, open for business. Honest work, fair prices. His first customer was a woman named Simone Garrett, who lived 3 streets over and had a 2009 Camry with a grinding sound that 3 different shops had given her 3 different explanations for. She'd found the sign in the window, walking to the bus stop. Devonte put the car on the lift, diagnosed a worn front wheel bearing in 20 minutes, quoted her $180 for parts and labor. She looked at him a long time before she said yes. He did the job in 90 minutes. When she picked the car up, she sat in the driver's seat and drove it down the block and back, and when she got out, she said, "That's the first time that car has been quiet in 2 years. She paid him. She told her sister. Her sister told her neighbor. By the end of the second week, Devonte had 6 appointments on a legal pad hanging next to the corkboard. He had no website, no social media, no Yelp page. What he had was word that spread the way word always spreads in neighborhoods where people have been burned by businesses that didn't take them seriously, fast, and with feeling. By the end of the first month, he was booked out 10 days. He still didn't have enough to pay himself a real wage. Everything he made went back into the shop: a used floor jack, a set of torque wrenches, a laptop for running diagnostic software on newer vehicles. He was sleeping on a cot in his grandmother's back room and eating whatever was in the house. Cora never said a word about it. She just kept setting plates in front of him and asking if he'd remembered to drink water. There were hard days. Days when a part he'd ordered came in wrong and he had to eat the cost. Days when a customer questioned his work because of how old he was, or because of the neighborhood, or because he didn't have a framed certificate on the wall. One man, a big guy in a Ram truck who'd come in for a transmission flush, stood in the bay and asked him, flat out, if he'd actually been trained for this or just watched some YouTube. Devonte handed him back his keys without a word and told him to have a good afternoon. There were also days that stayed with him for different reasons. A single mother named Priya Ashford who'd been told by a chain shop she needed $2,200 in repairs on a car Devonte fixed for $340. Because 2 of the 4 things they'd told her were wrong, and one of them was not a problem at all. She'd cried in the waiting area. Not dramatically, just quietly, her hand over her mouth, and Devonte had stood there not knowing exactly what to say, so he'd just told her to bring it back in 6 months for a free checkup. She'd brought cookies the next week, left them on the counter without making a big deal of it. Those were the moments he held on to. By month 3, he had a part-time helper, a 19-year-old named Cedric, who lived down the block and had been watching from the sidewalk long enough that Devonte had finally just asked him if he wanted to learn something. Cedric turned out to have good hands and better instincts. Devonte paid him what he could, which wasn't much, but Cedric showed up every day. By month 4, Devonte had bought a commercial account with a parts supplier, cutting his costs by 20%. He'd gotten a business license, a proper insurance policy, and a bank account for the shop. He'd also gotten his first Google review, 5 stars, left by Simone Garrett, who wrote a paragraph and a half about the wheel bearing and called him the most honest mechanic I've ever dealt with. By month 5, the wait for an appointment was 3 weeks. He was under the hood of a 2015 F-150 on a Tuesday morning in month 6 when he heard the front door open. He heard 2 sets of footsteps. He finished tightening the clamp he was working on, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and came around to the front. Harlan Dupree was standing in the middle of the bay. He was wearing the same kind of clothes as the first time. Business casual, pressed, the kind of outfit that says I don't do physical work. Next to him was a younger man Devonte didn't recognize, carrying a folder. Harlan looked around the shop for a long moment. The floor was clean. The lift was running. A car was in each bay, one in the air, one waiting. Cedric was doing a coolant flush in the back and had his earbuds in. A handwritten whiteboard near the front listed 12 appointments for the week. "Devonte," Harlan said, like they were old friends. "I have to say this is not what I expected." Devonte leaned against the workbench. "What did you expect?" Harlan smiled in that same way. "I'll be honest with you, I didn't think you'd make it past the first month. That space has chewed up 3 tenants in 2 years." He paused, looking at the whiteboard.
Looks like you've got a real operation here.
"I do," Devonte said. Harlan introduced the younger man as a representative from a commercial real estate investment group that had recently acquired Eastfield Commercial Holdings. The group was in the process of evaluating all properties in the portfolio. Several of the buildings were being repositioned, renovated, and re-leased at market rate. "Which means," Harlan said with a careful kind of lightness, "we'd be looking at a new lease structure for this space, bringing it in line with the current market." Devonte waited. Harlan named a number. It was 2.5 times what Devonte was paying. The bay was quiet except for the sound of Cedric's work in the back. Devonte looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. "I appreciate you coming to tell me in person," he said. "I'll need it in writing." Harlan nodded. The younger man made a note in his folder. "Of course," Harlan said. "We want to work with you. You've done something real here." He was still doing that smile. It would be a shame to lose a good tenant. After they left, Cedric came around from the back with one earbud out. "Who was that?" "Man who sold me the lease," Devonte said. He picked up the shop rag and went back to the F-150. "What'd he want? To charge me more to stay?" Cedric was quiet for a second. "You gonna?" Devonte didn't answer right away. He reached back under the hood. "Not if I don't have to." The thing about 6 months of work is that it builds things you don't always see in the day-to-day. It builds a reputation. It builds relationships. It builds a number in a bank account that starts to look like something. Devonte had been thinking about the building next door, another Eastfield property, a slightly larger space that had been empty since a flooring company moved out 8 months ago. For about 10 days before Harlan showed up, he'd had the thought the way you have thoughts when you're not quite ready to say them out loud, just turning it over. That evening, he sat at his grandmother's kitchen table with a legal pad and a calculator and worked through every number he had. Revenue by month, fixed costs, variable costs, what he'd built in the account, what a combined space would cost to operate versus what it could generate. He called a lawyer the next morning, a woman named Audra Fenwick who had an office on Green Street and who had helped the owner of a food truck Devonte knew set up an LLC. She was direct, didn't talk down to him, and charged flat fees. He told her what he was looking at. She called him back 2 days later. The flooring company's old space had actually been listed with a different brokerage, not Eastfield directly. The landlord of record was an individual, not the investment group. And that landlord, a retired electrician named Gregory Holt who lived in Burlington, had been trying to find a stable long-term tenant for the better part of a year. Gregory Holt was 71 years old, had owned the building since 1998, and had no patience for commercial real estate brokers or their fees. When Audra called him on Devonte's behalf, he wanted to talk to Devonte directly. They spoke for 45 minutes on the phone. Gregory asked him about his work, his customers, his plan. Devonte answered every question straight. At the end of the conversation, Gregory said, "I like people who can tell me what they're going to do and then do it. When do you want to look at the space?" They signed a 5-year lease 10 days later. The rent was below market. Gregory Holt wanted stability more than he wanted top dollar. Devonte wanted room to grow. He didn't tell Harlan Dupree until he had to. He sent a certified letter to Eastfield Commercial Holdings 30 days before his current lease was up. In it, he gave formal notice of non-renewal. Attached to the letter was a copy of the new lease on the building next door, along with a forwarding address for his business mail. 2 days later, his phone rang. "Harlan." "I have to say," Harlan started, "this is a surprise. I gave you 30 days notice," Devonte said. "That's what the lease requires. The new space, next door?" "That's right." A pause. "That building needs work." "So did this one," Devonte said. Harlan was quiet for a moment, then he said with a stiffness that hadn't been in his voice before, "You know we would have negotiated on the rent." I said we wanted to work with you. I know you did, Devonte said. I decided to go a different direction. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Devonte could hear the ambient sound of whatever office Harlan was sitting in. Papers, a phone ringing somewhere distant. Okay, Harlan said finally. Good luck to you. Thanks, Devonte said. I'll probably be fine. He met it without any edge. It was just the truth as he knew it. The new space was bigger by 400 square feet. It had 2 additional bays and a small glassed-in office area in the corner that Devonte put a desk in. The first desk he'd ever had in a place that was his. He hired a second technician, a woman named Faye Delacroix, who had 10 years of experience and had been working at a shop across town run by an owner who cut corners and didn't listen. She came in for an interview and spent 40 minutes looking at how Devonte had organized his tools, his parts inventory, his appointment system. Then she said, "When do I start?" Cedric got a raise and the title of lead assistant, a thing he pretended not to care about and then told his mother about that same evening. Devonte put a proper sign above the door. Steel letters, black on white. Caldwell Auto and Repair. Not fancy. Readable from the street. The Google reviews kept coming. He got a mention in a local newsletter that covered black-owned businesses in Guilford County. A reporter from the Greensboro paper called wanting to do a feature. Devonte declined, then called back 3 days later and said he'd changed his mind because Cora had told him that staying invisible was a choice and he needed to make sure it was the right one. The feature ran on a Thursday. It had a photograph of him standing in the bay with his arms crossed, looking directly at the camera, grease on his forearms, the lift behind him. The headline called him a quiet force in the neighborhood. He read it once, folded the paper, and went back to work. 6 weeks after the feature ran, he got a contract inquiry from a fleet manager at a medical transport company that ran 18 vans in the county. The manager, a methodical man named Gerald Sims, not that name. A man named Bart Hollander had been paying dealership rates for routine fleet maintenance and was tired of the scheduling delays. He wanted one shop, one contact, reliable turnaround. Devonte quoted him a monthly flat-rate contract. Bart countered. Devonte held firm on 2 points and gave on 1. They signed. 18 vans. Regular maintenance schedules. Predictable revenue. Devonte sat in his small glass office after Bart Hollander left and looked at the signed contract on his desk for a long time. He thought about the hydraulic lift that hadn't worked when he got there, the cot in his grandmother's back room, Dale Coburn's face the morning he'd handed in his notice. He thought about Harlan Dupree smiling with his eyes not in it. He picked up his phone and called Cora. "It's working," he said when she answered. She didn't ask him to explain what it was. She'd known what he was building. "Of course it is," she said. "Now eat something." There's a version of this story that gets told a lot, where the person who underestimated you shows up at the end, humbled, asking for something. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it doesn't. The ending doesn't always come in the form you expect, and sometimes the most honest thing you can say is that the real ending isn't a confrontation at all. It's a Tuesday morning when you're fully booked, your team is working, the lights are on in a building that belongs to you in every way that matters, and nobody who ever doubted you is in the room. Harlan Dupree didn't come back. His company listed the original space, brought it up to market rate, and leased it to a tile distributor. Devonte drove past it once, months later, and didn't feel much of anything. He had somewhere to be. What Devonte Caldwell built wasn't an accident, and it wasn't magic, and it wasn't luck, though people would call it all three depending on how it made them feel to explain it. It was work done in the right order by someone who understood that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you let it be won. Harlan Dupree handed him a key to a broken building with a smile that said, "You'll fail." What he actually handed him was the first page of something. Harlan just didn't know how to read it. Devonte did. He always had.